Welcome to the Vertical MRO Podcast, where we dive into the world of helicopter maintenance, repair, and overhaul. In each episode, we talk with the technicians, engineers, and experts who keep helicopters flying. Because at the end of the day, no maintenance, no mission.
So we had a scenario where the client got hold of us in a bit of a quandary because these aircraft were on lease for another 3 years. The tech crew were essentially marched at gunpoint, given 3 days to leave because of the regime change. And the aircraft were basically pushed out of the hangar that was provided for them to the back of the airfield. And this is a hot, dusty country. You've got effectively 30 days to get these aircraft out of this country. Now, the rough book value of those aircraft at the time was about $60 million US. So you can see the lessor was particularly concerned. The simple fact was they had these assets. If they didn't do something on two levels, one, maintaining a maintenance schedule, and B, getting them out of the country, they were write-offs. It's a bit of an international rescue scenario. How the hell are we going to do it? So we got called in on that, and the organisation basically gave us, and this was the respect we had. We had a keep it real, but don't quote, just do it.
Welcome to part 2 of our conversation. If you missed part 1, you can find it in our previous episode. Welcome to the Vertical MRO Podcast, brought to you by Vertical HeliCASTS in partnership with Vertical Magazine. In this 2-part Vertical MRO series, Ronnie Reese and I sit down with Don Lockie of Aviation Resource Group, a seasoned expert in international shipping and logistics, to unpack the high-stakes world of moving aviation assets across the globe. Don shares his journey into the aviation industry and the lessons learned from decades of navigating complex logistics. From understanding unique customer needs to managing razor-thin margins, he explains why experience and specialized knowledge are critical when the cargo is an aircraft. The discussion covers the hidden risks of oversimplifying logistics, the importance of risk management, and why building trusted partnerships can make or break a mission. With real-world examples, including aircraft shipments and unexpected challenges, Don illustrates how innovative problem-solving, effective planning, and clear communication keep operations on track. Whether you're managing fleet maintenance, overseeing part supply, or coordinating large-scale aviation moves, this conversation delivers valuable insights into the logistics and expertise required to succeed in today's global aviation market. Thank you to our sponsors, Robinson Helicopter Company, Safe Structure Designs, and Precision Aviation Group. Hey, welcome to the Vertical MRO Podcast. I'm today's host, John Gray. I have an international conversation in store for today, one with a new friend of ours who I'm excited to talk to today and excited to see at the Vertical MRO conferences, speaking on a topic that has gotten a lot of traction. It sounds like of all the registrations, the pre-registrations for the Vertical MRO conference, the topic that Don's going to speak on today, international shipping and logistics, has garnered a lot of attention. So excited to talk to Don about that. Before we get to Don, though, I need to introduce today's co-host. Ronnie, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back on, John.
Yeah, of course. Always stoked to talk to you. You just came back from an international trip. How was that?
It was great. I started middle of July up in Alaska and then went all the way down to Brazil and got to experience about the same temperatures on opposite ends of the earth. So that was fun.
That's cool. Always happy to have you on. Look forward to seeing you at the Vertical MRO conference coming up. It's, man, the year is flying by. It's nearly August and we're not far away from the conference.
Yeah, there's a lot of people I've been hearing about that are excited. They're sending their people, they're, getting their exhibitions ready and so forth. So it's going to be a great time there in Kelowna and Irving, Texas. Yeah,
looking forward to that. Don, back to you. You're coming to us from quite a ways away. You're coming to us from New Zealand today. How are things down in New Zealand?
Well, we're having in the South Island, a relatively mild winter, but in the north, they're getting a lot of rain and, changing in climate conditions. I've seen that we're getting more rain than probably in any lifetime memories and changing a lot of river courses and things. So it's been a change of winter down here in that respect. Yeah. So.
It's interesting you'd say that because I feel like the U.S. has had a very similar phenomenon, although it's summer for us. We've had tons of flooding from Texas, essentially all across the U.S. I know flooding it does happen, but it seems like it's happening at a more rapid pace. It seems like every day you log on to the news and you see something happening, New Mexico, Texas, just wild seeing the destruction. So
back in 2023 wasn't a good year for New Zealand with the typhoon that went through. Don?
Yeah, that's correct. That was Ebola. Gabrielle, the Gisborne one, yeah, and that was a pretty devastating one that went through on the North Island East Coast. Took a loss of life. Generally, for New Zealand, we're pretty lucky that we tend not to be affected with loss of life by a great number because I guess our population density is relatively low and our infrastructure for search and rescue is pretty good. And primarily, that is driven a lot of it by the rotary industry. We have a quasi-governmental scenario, which effectively is the equivalent of US FEMA. It's a thing called civil defence, and they have funding which allows a lot of the private operators with H125s and H145 primarily doing a lot of the lift work into those regions, and that has probably kept a lot of loss of life under control through that.
That's the one interesting thing that all these storms have highlighted, whether it's this year's flooding or the hurricanes from last year or what you're talking about, or even going back 20 years to Katrina. Helicopters have really been at the forefront of the life-saving measures that have taken place. It really makes me proud to be a part of the community that we're a part of when you see the capabilities that helicopters bring to bear in these different scenarios. The fire side of what we're talking about is, I guess, the extreme opposite, right? You got floods and fires, and sometimes they go hand in hand. A lot of times you'll have a fire, then you'll have flooding as a result of that afterward because there's no vegetation to kind of hold that water back. With fire, a lot of fire agencies, as far as contract companies, are kind of chasing fire across the world. So I think that's where I kind of start to think about what you're involved in with logistics, with international shipping. How do we get these resources from North America to Australia, New Zealand, or down to South America or Spain or wherever these firefighting assets need to get to? That's kind of the one thing that I think of from a mission standpoint that comes to bear with international shipping. So excited to get into some of that with you. But before we do that, let's just start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to where you are, and how you essentially as a kid became interested in aviation.
Yeah, well, I guess my story is pretty common to most of us in one format in the aviation game. It's there's something that makes a click. I was very much a classic aviation geek. Still am just an old aviation geek these days. Where possible, I'd hang around the local airfield, which I made myself a bit annoying to the engineers and asking dumb questions and being a skid biter basically. But prior to that, I grew up relatively close to the South Island's main Air Force base at the time, and that was where the UH-1 Hueys were based, and the Americans call Texans, we call the Harvards, and so they were based basically about a mile and a half from where I lived. So consequently, and my mother tells me that apparently when they were doing night training as a baby, it was impossible to get to sleep. I was constantly wanting to try and climb out the window to have a look at what was going on. So I guess it was pretty addicted to the smell of kerosene, I guess, is what it boiled down to. And it's kind of carried on to this stage in life now that my mother's been replaced by a wife who says the same thing. All I do as soon as anything flies overhead, I'm racing out to have a look at what it is. So,
I think that's the fun thing about our community is all of us kind of have that same passion for aviation. I'll push my own kids out of the way so I can get out the door and see what's flying through first, And Ronnie, I'm sure you're the same way, right?
Jet fuel and coffee, the best smells in the morning. Can't get away from it.
So how did you get from, the child that wouldn't go to sleep because you want to see what aircraft's flying to actually working in the industry?
Well, I guess, again, my path in the industry was, I guess, relatively typical of a lot. The biggest difficulty for me was that I'm a very good procrastinator, and I tended to find good excuses not to do things, so or go and do something else. So our military was relatively small on aviation opportunities, and so I decided to go the civilian route. Started getting local aero club, did my local flying, gained my confidence, then essentially decided to go and do what we call in New Zealand the OE, the overseas experience. And at the day, it was a kind of norm. What happened was you could get a 2-year visa into Europe, or basically into the United Kingdom, which gave you Europe, and a large percentage of New Zealanders and still do it to this day. But you'd sort of shoot off on a one-way ticket at about 21, 22 years old. So the draw of that was quite important to me. So flying kind of put on the back burner. So long story short, after a few years of exploring around Europe and etc. and doing the sort of I came back to New Zealand, and one of the jobs I got while I was in Europe was, let's just say, it was very, very well paid. And that meant, and the goal of that was to bring that money home, which I did, which converted to flying lessons for commercial and instrument ratings, etc. But of course, I timed that essentially with one of the great economic flat periods, which meant that suddenly everyone was furloughing their pilots and there wasn't any work. So it was this vicious circle. My experience, apart from that work-wise, was logistics. And I had done a management cadetship. I guess these days you call it an internship, but it was a full 3-year training course with what was New Zealand's largest trucking organisation. I guess similar, those of you older will remember Roadway in the US or Yellow Freight. It was a sort of similar organisation to that in New Zealand. And so I did 4 years with them and learned everything from basically how to drive a fully rigged prime mover with logs on the back through to doing the accounting and budgeting for an owner driver to bring them on board as to take on a truck and run it as a business. And that was an amazing grounding. And I guess what it gave me was a solid logistics background, which I would recommend to this day, anyone in aviation, you've got to have a fallback, because otherwise you're screwed.
Yeah.
So basically coming back to New Zealand, getting all my tickets and then no work, I then decided, well, I'm getting in the wrong end of 20 now. I better start, finding an alternative, developing the career. So I got into international logistics, working with a smaller company. Another little side story. New Zealand is probably, statistically, I don't want to say this is a fact, but I think it's pretty accurate. We have probably the highest number of smaller businesses per capita of anywhere in the world. It's an accepted business policy in New Zealand here is that if you've got 5 or 6 people in your Amar and Par shop, you're actually quite often trusted and welcomed. So in logistics, the tendency, and the other thing with New Zealand and freight, was that what's known in the trade as a consigned controlled market. In other words, you guys are doing the decision on the freight. You're based in New Zealand, so you make the control. So the result was we have one of the highest number of freight forwarders numbers probably in the Western in the world, per capita. And in those days, going out on your own was, again, as I say, it was a sort of, you've got as high as you can get because Mar and Par aren't going anywhere, so you flick off and go on your own. And essentially that's what I did was I'd end up working for one of the larger multinationals, one that's colouring is red and yellow, we all know it, and I had a relatively senior position in there, and but realised I wasn't a corporate animal, decided that knowing my experience in aviation, and I think we'll probably talk about a story about this soon, but the understanding of aviation, the understanding of logistics, I saw an opportunity to create something that was quite niche and, as it turned out, very successful.
It's interesting when you look backwards in your life and you look at the experiences and the things you did as a younger man, and then you fast forward to your career now, how those things played a pivotal role, had a pivotal impact in your ability to kind of do the thing you want. Your logistics background is what propelled you into aviation, which I think is really interesting that you kind of brought up. That's kind of critical, especially for what you're doing, to have that critical infrastructure and logistics background. So super interesting. You brought up this story. Let's go ahead and hop into a story now that you're thinking of.
Thank you to our sponsor, Robinson Helicopter Company, the choice for unrivaled safety and reliability, so you can accomplish any mission with confidence. For more than half a century, Robinson has been at the forefront of the helicopter industry. From the R-22 to the R-66 turbine, Robinson makes helicopters accessible so more people can accomplish more missions. Climb higher. For additional information, visit www.robinsonheli.com.
Yeah, well, basically within this organisation I was part of, it wasn't one I mentioned before there with the yellow and red, but it was another large multi, and I had my role in there was effectively, well, I guess it was the logistics equivalent of a hangar rat. I had a bit of everything. I was sometimes driving the van, sometimes in the office doing paperwork, the odd occasion sales. It was very classic of, I guess, the New Zealand way of doing business was an adaptability. And we weren't too hung up like we are now with a lot of health and safety rules. So there were certain expectations, but there was a tendency to be, well, grab the forklift and go and load it in the truck and go and deliver X, Y, Z. And we had a situation where a component, we had an aircraft that when I say we, the operator in the South Island had an A-star effectively was AOG. It was in the high tourist season in New Zealand. There was a lot of pressure. And this component, it was to do with the rotor blades. It was to do with in the head. It was a critical component. I won't go into specifics of what it is for obvious reasons, but it was urgently brought out on a fast track service and hit Auckland, and there was a paperwork hitch. Now, in that process, what interested me was the guy that I was reporting to. His attitude was, well, it can't be that important because it's small. And the fact it's got fragile on it is irrelevant. It was intentionally put into a position where it was left behind, inverted commas, because the paperwork wasn't quite right. And because it had a high value, there was a tax issue, not a tariff, just a simple what we refer to in New Zealand as GST, which is equivalent of VAT. And it was just purely on the landed value, and there was a discrepancy. The particular boss was not interested in dealing with it. The fact that it had AOG, we knew that it was AOG. There'd been indirect communication to us from the operator in the South Island. There was this stubbornness that kind of got in the way. Long story short, eventually when it did finally move, it was, as opposed to continuing air freighting through to Queenstown, it was put on a truck. Now, those of you who don't know New Zealand, the driving distance between the North and South Island, if you had a perfect run in a car and you got the ferry connection, you're about a 24-hour journey. With a truck, you're effectively 3 to 4 days. So consequently, then, when it was placed on the truck, it was cleared, it was all released. But it was almost put on there by the individual as a form of spite. And his argument being, oh, well, I flew down there one day as a tourist with my wife, and the pricing was extortionate. God, they make so much money, they can have a bit of pain. And it was a kind of it was an enlightenment to me that there was an issue in the understanding of our industry, as in the rotary industry, and what it does in terms of to other industries. So the result was, long story short, that shipment made it through. The guy got back in the air, but I know for a fact that he lost 3 days worth of flying. He lost effectively 2 large contracts. Massive effect on essentially going back to the Mar and Par type operator, which is what he was, all due to the arrogance of an individual in Auckland whose attitude was strict. So what that brought home to me was that there was a lack of understanding in the logistics field about aviation and how exposed aviation was to that lack of understanding. It was a bit of a dangerous quandary coming through. Consequently, that was where I got the idea, or the germ of an idea, that there was a market for a specialist logistics provider that understood global logistics, but also understood aviation and had the ability to ask specific questions and clarify, why are you doing it this way? Is there an alternative way to do it? And we were very successful in that over the time.
It's interesting as you talk about the box as it's labeled fragile. I can picture in my head receiving a rotor blade that we had sent out for repair, and it comes back to the hangar and it's in a wood, freight box with fragile all over the place. And the box was just about shattered. Whoever transported that thing must have thought it was a hacky sack, because it was a mess, and I'm like, how does this happen? So what you bring up is critically important. We're dealing with high value items. We're dealing with operators where time is of the essence. If you're losing out on days of operation or contracts, potentially, that can make or break a lot of folks in their smaller operations.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, from your perspective, who you see as your kind of your ordinary customer, the folks that are dealing with this most often, and what types of things they're typically sending out?
Yeah, look, that's a complicated question because there is no real typical customer. I guess the key take home is this, is that whether it's the Ma and Pa one helicopter operator or the leaseor that's multi-million with a S92, that's the expectations are still the same. Blades need to turn to get return on revenue, and the key things, and one of the things I'm still to this day very hot on, is honesty. You don't need to tell someone who doesn't understand the nitty-gritty of a logistics problem to them in in-depth detail. But what you don't do is you don't lie to them, and it is vice versa. Don't tell me as a logistics person, I've got to have that blade or this by Monday morning because of da-da-da, and then you drop everything and you make it happen, and then you happen to go out to the airfield a couple of days later and the blade's still sitting in the box, or and that can be very infuriating as well, because in many ways logistics is very much like aviation in the terms it relies on trust, relationship, and a certain amount of favors. And if you work with a warehouse to bring that container forward, to get that component out, to get the government departments to look at it quicker, there's a lot of requests and relationships that have to be done right. Now, if you do that too often, you cry wolf and you lose respect. And this comes back to that point I'm getting at, is it's got to be a two-way street. Sure, a good logistics operator will do quite well business-wise. If you do it right, you can make a reasonably good return. But the margins are actually quite thin. What you're relying on is good turnover, good flow, and not too many snarl ups on the way through. And it, again, comes back to partnershiping again. If you use the blade box example there before, John, okay, if you're using a blade box and you're now bringing it back into somewhere like Canada, New Zealand, or Australia, you're going to have agricultural people all over that timber. Is it correct? Has it been done? Has there been an agreement that the blade repair facility is going to keep that blade box inside up on a rack for the 6 weeks while the work's been done on the blade? Can they audit that and verify that? Because if the blade box is chucked outside in the yard out the back of somewhere in Texas and it's become the home for a local spider species, even though the timber is all approved, if there's any concern and that box gets an inspection, a random inspection by an agriculture person in one of those 3 countries, and there's a spider's web suddenly secured there, you now have created a massive logjam that is beyond the capacity of any logistics provider to fix up, because you're now dealing with a government department which is protecting the environment of that country. That all falls back to the customer ensuring that their supplier is doing their part to ensure it's a partnership all the way through. And if it's done right, the low margins that everybody's making in our game, the hours put in justify the smaller return. What really can be a problem is, you're making 3%, but you're spending days sorting out a snarl up that didn't need to happen. Yeah. I can be a little bit more blunter and use stronger words. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to, though.
So Don, bringing it back to entry level, what is logistics, right? There are a lot of people here that may be not aware of all the complications that you're saying. It's very complicated. Most of us think that you just go down to the FedEx store, put a sticker on something, and it's going to get halfway around the world with no issues, right? But what you're talking about logistics is from the smallest bearing to shipping an S92 around the world. You deal with multiple shippers, customs, government agencies, paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. Can you kind of walk through kind of the basics, the core of what it is that logistics folks deal with, so they just get a little bit of an understanding before we get into some of the more complex things like shipping aircraft halfway around the world?
Safe Structure Designs offers creative, customizable ergonomic safety solutions with over 20 years of experience. Their custom design process is free, ensuring safety and efficiency. Let them create your ideal solution. Visit www.safe-2.com. That's www.safe-2.com for more information.
Sure. In the reality is, what we're dealing with is whether you're shifting this coffee cup or an S92, the fundamentals are the same. It's when those of us who fly, the basic physics kick in, your principles of flight. Whether it's a an R22 or an S92, it doesn't really matter. It's still physics. So you've got documentation. You need agreements before the shipment is even moving, and that's between the customer. So Ronnie, you and John have got an arrangement for an item. You guys have done your back room. You've come up to an agreement on price, whether it's a service, a maintenance scheduling work, or he's buying a component off you, etc. You then go out to find whoever is in control of the logistics, i.e. paying the freight, whether it's consigned or controlled, i.e. you as the shipper or John as the consignee. That's establishment. From there, we have what's known, and again, this is for a whole more detailed podcast we want to go into. There is things called Incoterms, which effectively are legal terms that clearly state what the logistics agreement is, whether it's prepaid, freight collect, et cetera. Okay, so you've established that. So between the two of you guys, you've worked out that you've got we'll use a rotor blade. No, we'll keep it even simpler. You've got a
bearing.
A bearing. Yep, you've got a simple bearing, and you've sold to John. You've come up with a plan. So you've agreed that you're going to do. John doesn't want to know anything about the freight. He says, "I'll just chuck it on DHL. It's easy." Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Okay. You then can go to DHL, but the problem for you is that you know that DHL is going to cost you an arm and a leg because you're operating in the middle of nowhere. It's logistically quite expensive. All the things.
It's a $25,000 bearing, right? So there's a lot of risk in case it get lost.
Correct. And so you start going, well, how do we change it? So then you go to your freight partner. Now, and this is where you then establish, and your freight partner, whether it be a Redfort, an ARG, DHL, FedEx, whichever. But as you get to the bigger players, what you're finding is they're becoming more and more automated in their process. They're a bit like buying an airline ticket. Our parents would have never thought that you could go online and buy your own plane ticket. You had to go to a travel agent. The freight industry is starting to head into that area, but thanks to border complications, there's still a need for the human involvement. Okay, so the questions are paperwork, that we need a bill of sale. What agreement was made between you and John on that process? A value declared, and that value has to be a real value. You can't, if it's a $25,000 gold-plated bearing and you sell it for $2.50, yeah, it'll leave New Zealand okay, or leave your origin. But when it gets to the destination to John, the foreign entity customs authority will go, doesn't look right. And that is essentially more and more controlled by AI technology and moving through of data. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you agree on that. And then effectively what happens is your forwarder, your shipping partner will give you a document that you complete, which is essentially an SLI, Shipper's Letter of Instruction. It says who you are, where it's going, the agreed freight terms, description of the goods, a value declared, if it's DG, non-G, anything of that kind of thing, requirements, fragile, et cetera, and ideally you'd have on there things like required in Southern California by the state. So you've got some clear thing. And now you'd also, at that point, if your relationship is right, you're then either letting the forwarder just go ahead and do it, or you might be asking for a quotation. Okay, when you come back, and the forwarder will then work out an air price and a sea price, depending on the size. And you've then got the quote. You choose which one to go, A to B. Now, in that SLI, you've also stated, well, you're consignee controlled. You're shipping the item through to LA, but once it hits the United States coast, it's no longer, it now becomes John's responsibility. So he would then get the paperwork forwarded to him by you. And then there would also, because that's been given to you by the person here in New Zealand, and then that forwarder or UK or wherever the relationships come from, will have gone to a partner agent at the destination. So I would, if it was in my case, I would have then sent you a set of documents, and a set of documents would have gone through to great, Californian Logistics Co. And so it would go across to them, and they would have on there, please contact John Gray because of with this shipment coming through. So they would then ask John, what is your details? What registration numbers do you have for import regulations? Do you have any concessions, et cetera, et cetera? And then basically they'd ask John, do you want us to do the customs clearance and delivery out to where your home is? Now, John at that point may turn around and go, nope, I've got my own people, which is fine. He can get his own people to do that part of it. And then there's what's called a transfer fee, pretty logical, a small handover fee of a documentation between the agent that I've used as my representative of the United States and the broker and the agent that John wants to use. And then the movement moves through. And then finally delivery through. Now, the key thing to consider in these programs, of course, is the change of ownership point. Now, if it's, and this is where the INCO terms come in, some of you will have heard things like FCA, DDU, DDP, CBT, FOB was an old term that's still very much used.
Mm-hmm.
And they clearly show, and you can very easily go on to Google and put in Incoterms 2010, and you'll get a beautiful chart that shows. And this is a key part of the logistics equation. It's depending on what Incoterm you purchase is when the change of ownership occurs. Now, the change of ownership is of no concern if you've been paid by John before you put it on the boat, before you gave it to shipped it. But if it gets damaged en route, that's where the insurance comes into an issue. Because if you've done an arrangement that means it's still your ownership until it comes out of the boat or out of the airplane in LA, even though John's paid you and you want to walk away, you're still responsible until his agent uplifts it over there. So if there's a damage consideration. So very critical to have a look at. When it's one simple bearing in a box, not such a big deal. More likely there to be a total loss scenario than a damage. But of course, if it's a full aircraft, well, then you've got a completely different set of discussions to have. And then each country has its own jurisdictions, of course, and we don't have to get onto it now because, to be honest, in the 35 minutes we've been talking, the tariff rules have probably changed again. But each country has its own jurisdictions. And, for example, shipments into New Zealand currently in aviation are classed effectively as duty-free, but we do have a value tax called goods and services tax of 15%. And the tariff scenario is complicating that whole mix, which, again, is for a different conversation. Does that kind of, I know that's a long story,
Yes.
but does that help what you're after?
So all that to say that, especially when you're dealing with very expensive, very complex things where you have high risk, you don't want to be trying to do this yourself. You want to be dealing with experts that can help you walk through to make sure your goods get there when you need it, on time, and perfectly in shape, right? Not damaged. You want to work
100%.
with experts to help you do that.
Yeah, and just relying on the fact that that's why they exist. We're not there because we're trying to screw you over out of some of your profit. There is a logical reason why we're here, and that's the key part of it.
And what you described is a super complicated situation. Some of the stuff that you brought up, like the box winding up in the back, backyard of a facility in Texas, and it now has spiders in it. And I laugh because, one, I hate spiders, but two, like, that's something that you wouldn't probably consider if you knew the implications going forward, right? That it could get held up in customs and by agriculture. Like, it didn't even cross my mind. But now that you've brought that up, I'm sure somebody's going to go check their boxes in the back of the facility. Like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have these here.
It makes it sound like me buying a house is easier to do than shipping an S92 across the world.
Well, guys, I think a good example, and this is real experience, with all the fire guys, they're shipping their gear to country X for 3-4 months work.
Right.
All the shipping equipment is just racked and put down on the ground at the back. And I've had circumstances myself where, we're putting an aircraft, we're taking it off the traveling skid that it was on. We'd thrown it back onto its skids. And I was literally just having a little cold drink with my resting up against the traveling skid. And I looked to my left and out came some redbacks, which is an Australian, nasty little spider. And it was a whole family. And they just had got themselves in there. And it's just one of those things, that ultimately is something that is became to be very important. Plan what you're going to do with the gear. It's as much as important that that it's all there, clean and secure, as opposed to even getting lost. There'll be quite a few guys listening to this who will talk about stories where they've gone to get the machine and pack it, and a critical part of the shipping gear is just not there.
That's kind of a good segue into my next question. Again, going into the complexities of what you're describing, there's a lot involved. This isn't a situation where you just go to your local FedEx guy and go, here, take this to this place. Can you highlight some of the pitfalls of taking that approach? You're like, oh, this isn't really a big deal. There's not a lot just go do it. Can you kind of talk about the cost of doing that, and then we'll go from there into kind of what you do offer?
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
Don't get me wrong. I think that the technology moving forward is pretty amazing, and the ability now to move, something in a box that's as big as this glass, is real easy. And it's made things more accessible. It's easier to price up, etc. And the integrators, that's the term for the larger players like DHL, FedEx, UPS, etc. They have amazingly good systems, and they're quick, they're efficient, and they essentially, the only time a human, and literally in cases the only time humans are physically involved, is at the initial receipt and the final delivery. Once it comes out of the van, it's onto an automated shuttling system around. Think what Amazon's created. You've got to be totally respectful of what that does. But I guess it comes down to the fact that, if you had a significantly important activity with your partner or with family, would you go to AI and say, pick me a restaurant or pick me a hotel and and let AI do it all without double checking it? And that's the reality. And the problem you have, of course, is with these larger players, is if it goes a little bit off-piste, you have a lack of humans to get access to resolve the issue. Now, I can imagine individuals from those companies might be listening now, be jumping up and saying, it's not true. But the simple factor, you look at the numbers of shipments they're moving versus the number of personnel they have. It's an economics model for them. So come back into that scenario. If you've got something that's out of gauge, out of shape, single, you've only got one of, so if it gets broken, you can't just get another one off the shelf. Then you need to start analyzing and making practical choices. And then this comes back to what I said at the start of our chat. It's a partnership, and an honesty partnership. It's working with the operator and coming up with what do you need to, what are your expectations, and work from there. Now, the first thing that kicks in, as soon as you go away from an automated system, the price goes up because now you're dealing with humans. So then you come into analysis and go, well, yep, it's a 5.2 meter long blade. It's sitting in a box, making it 6 meters, 20 odd feet. And we've got to get it. And the aircraft is currently working in northern Australia. What are we doing? How do we get our paperwork correct? What are our options? Is there a way we can do ESC? If we get it into Sydney, and this is again, the AI system may think, we'll consider, well, we'll take it in a US example, they'll run into LA, but you still got to get to Moscow and Idaho in the middle of winter. You've got a lot of complications to get something that's 6 meters long to Moscow and Idaho tomorrow. And this is where so it comes back to that. It's essentially, and another good example, and I hope I'm staying in the target of what you're asking me here. I'm just not sure. Am I giving you kind of the answer your question? Or?
Yeah. Again, I'm just looking for, for folks that may think, no, I could just take this thing and go to FedEx. They could get it. This is fine for them to do. And then they realize at the end of the day that, that their blade box gets there and it's completely destroyed and the blade they need is not usable. That's obviously less expensive than utilizing someone like yourself, whose expertise lies in logistics in that world.
Yeah. I think there's obviously a lot of risk. That's what you're talking about, Don, between customs and delays and various other things. But the risk management where you're talking about Incoterms and various other things is absolutely critical. Just in the last couple of years, we talked about shipping S-92s all around the world. 2 S-92s were stuck underneath an overpass.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Truck driver hit it. Those are 2 very damaged S-92s. Who's responsible for that? Right. If you're doing this and expecting FedEx to pay it, they're not. Right. And it all comes down to the dealing with your aviation shipping advisors of understanding who has risk, when does it go, who's responsible for getting it to land, sea, train, plane, automobile, however it gets to you. You need specialists to help you get those things right.
Yep. You should be sitting in my seat, mate. Yeah, I'm probably trying to
work. No, thank you.
Yeah, I'm digging down into the detail, which is possibly the biggest fault, is that people look at it and go, Jesus, it's hard work. How do you do it? I don't want to worry about it. As opposed to going, hang on, we need to invest. If you're going to build a house, you got to get the foundations right. And the same with good logistical thinking. And the successful players out there who've created, and I'll use an example, Carlson as an operation, they do most of their own logistics themselves, but they didn't start doing that. They've learned and they kept learning. And every time they try something, they try a new idea, but they're within their own people. They've created this energy and enthusiasm, and they're virtually doing the impossible. They've just brought, late last year, they purchased the New Zealand Air Force's C-130H fleet. And they've just, which included 4 aircraft, they purchased them, and those aircraft, as is where is in New Zealand, they've just flown them to their base, just north. I can't remember if it's gone to Canada or into the US, but anyway, the story I'm trying to say there is they've learnt and they still utilised a freight forwarder to be part of that association. Another organisation that I was directly involved with. My partner agent I work with, Navigate in Europe, we're assisting a Black Hawk movement out of for a US based parts operator based in Dakota, North Dakota, and those in the industry will know who that is. And that was shifting effectively over 20 UH-60 Black Hawks from ADF and all the related equipment out of Australia. And now that required coordination, planning, but most importantly, it included a hell of a lot of partnership, working with the management team within the customer, establishing needs, working out, and, we shipped, the 22 aircraft arrived, what we call default, delivery in full on time, and that involved transporting them by road to a port, getting them on a vessel, moving them across to Tacoma, and then moving by road Tacoma through to North Dakota. And that didn't just happen because everyone was sort of, we'll have a few beers and talk about it. That required coordination, but most importantly, a constant ability to be checking back in. So it's, I guess the best analogy I can give is, airplanes and helicopters fly because of paperwork, but they also fly because of checklists and monitoring. And it's 85% routine boredom and 15% sheer terror. It's pretty much that analogy.
Thanks for joining us for part 1 of this conversation. Make sure you don't miss part 2.
Stand by for a message after a word from our sponsors.
Thank you to our sponsor, Robinson Helicopter Company, the choice for unrivaled safety and reliability so you can accomplish any mission with confidence. For more than half a century, Robinson has been at the forefront of the helicopter industry. From the R-22 to the R-66 turbine, Robinson makes helicopters accessible so more people can accomplish more missions. Climb higher. For additional information, visit www.robinsonheli.com.
Safe Structure Designs offers creative, customizable ergonomic safety solutions with over 20 years of experience. Their custom design process is free, ensuring safety and efficiency. Let them create your ideal solution. Visit www.safe-2.com. That's www.safe-2.com for more information.
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
Thank you for listening to this special 2-part series on the Vertical MRO Podcast. A huge thank you to Don Lockie for sharing his extensive expertise in international aviation logistics, highlighting the importance of experience, risk management, and trusted partnerships in moving aircraft worldwide. Don't miss Don Lockie at the Vertical MRO Conference, and thank you to Navigate for making that possible. For more information on Navigate, go to navi-gate.be. We hope you found these insights helpful. Stay tuned for more in-depth conversations and industry insights. Until next time, see you later.